We have 70% microplastics in our body. At one of these negotiation events, we handed out a cookie, like a credit card. And we said, have you had your weekly dose of microplastics? Because there was a statistic that came out that we're ingesting the equivalent of a credit card's worth of microplastics.
You're listening to A Climate Change. This is Matt Matern, your host. I've got a great guest on the program today, Antoinette Vermilye. She is the co-founder of the Gallifrey Foundation. She is into marine conservation, a champion of women and environmental leadership, as well as helping, reduce the use of plastics and overfishing and many other things. And so welcome to the program, Antoinette.
Thanks so much, Matt.
There's so many different topics to cover in the environmental space. And one of the ones that I missed that I think I read you were involved in was ocean mining, which I know has kind of reared its head recently in the Trump administration, wanting to greenlight ocean seabed mining for American companies, which...
Actually, it's a Canadian company.
It's a Canadian company.
It's an interesting story. So just to give your listeners an overview, when about 50 years ago, when we were talking about the laws of the sea, the idea was, and I think many people have this impression that at the bottom of the ocean, it's deep and dark and nothing can thrive. And there's cold, intense pressure, everything that we imagined. And that was the basis on which the law that governs the ocean was devised. In the 70s, 80s, 90s, we actually got down further and further in the ocean and discovered quite the opposite, that it's teeming with life. And I don't know if any of you have seen the hydrothermal vents with these spouts and toxic chemicals streaming out of 400 degrees centigrade, filled with white snow crabs and all sorts of creatures which technically you would have thought would not be able to survive. And that's when we're learning so much about how life can thrive on this planet. And along the way, we've also discovered that we've been picking things up and doing research on them, we've discovered that there were some metals that could have been of interest. Particularly the new vernacular has been for the green transition, because these are rare earth minerals. And so what has happened is, over the last 10 years particularly, up until now, and in fact to today, no permit has been issued by the International Seabed Authority, to actually exploit mining.
Yeah, it is a tragedy if we were to do it, because we certainly can do surface mining of these minerals and still get them. And if we do need them, which arguably we do, there's certainly ways to get them that are less harmful to the environment. And we shouldn't go deep sea mining. It is a bizarre situation that the U.S. hasn't ratified this treaty and has kind of played as an outlier in this process for decades. Really, it's really an unusual scenario, and of course, the Trump administration's, throwing yet another curveball into the scenario.
I think in the end, as we've said, the actual company is a Canadian company. The ship is based in the Netherlands. The financial headquarters are in Switzerland. The flagship is Malta. How those countries and going to actually sanction breaking international laws and insurance and risk. So I actually tend to think that this may be a storm in a teacup. Of course, we have to take it seriously, because if you're going to bulldoze through all of that, then there are far greater implications about international relations, and that could have long-term consequences in other areas. And the other point I would just like to say is that the actual metals that they're looking to get are in these potato-sized nodules that you find lying at the bottom of the ocean floor. So you're going to go down, if you do this, and this has been one of the issues of the scientists and particularly those working and what they're discovering with biodiversity. These things take 5 million years to accrete, because it's basically sediment around tooth, a bone, a tiny chip that has slowly accreted with sediment over this amount of time. And we're going to go down, pick it up, probably churn up the seabed, and that does not return because it's so deep. So that will leave a long-lasting scar. But more importantly, we're going to use it for something that maybe be an electric vehicle or something like that will last how long? 5, 10 years? Imagine 5 million years to use something for a 5 to 10 year life. Is that stewardship of our planet, of our resources?
Absolutely not. And, I loved how you kind of broke it down as to all the different players in this, whether it's Malta and Switzerland and the Netherlands, and all of those are places in which the bad decision making could stop, and places where countries and citizens can intervene and say, hey, is this what we want our governments to be supporting, our companies to be supporting? The answer is absolutely not. And hopefully the pressure can be put to bear to stop it. And as you said, hopefully it's a tempest in a teapot, and we move on to the next a million challenges that we have. Let's take us back to the beginning, Antoinette, as to what started your journey towards environmentalism in the beginning.
Okay, so as a kid, I was brought up in West Africa. Used to go to the beach there and see the fisher people go out in these little canoes breaking through very strong waves. I mean, these are waves that are surfing waves. I mean, they're really powerful, and they'd go through and they come back with their catch. And as a young child who is not conditioned to life and death really upset me. So seeing fish dying was an incredibly powerful thing for me. So I appreciate it now in hindsight and understood that was a lifestyle. But I've always felt very strongly about how do you protect our environment, and how do you protect creatures or the environment that cannot defend itself. That I have felt is a very strong role. Why the ocean? Because it covers 70% of the planet. We are made of 70% water. Ocean has about 70% microplastics, so do we. So we've got a lot of similarities at the moment. And so my journey actually began in seriousness about 12 years ago, when we said, okay, we're going to get involved in this. And so I just need to say my background, I'm not a marine scientist. I basically was like many people in the street. You went out, you did your job, you probably watched a few documentaries, read some books and went, oh yeah, that's terrible. What can I do? And that was my starting point. What can I do? So the difference is I packed up all my risk and fear of being humiliated or rebutted or being told you're stupid. And I started asking questions. And so it ended up with my finding, actually coincidentally to where I live now, which is in Switzerland. Right down the road is an organization called the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN. And little beknownst to me, and I'm sure to many listeners, this is the kind of the mothership that spawned WWF. So we all know WWF, but very few people know IUCN, which has it works with policymakers, governments, scientists, and you have access to thousands of scientists. So I was in a very fortunate position because we started working with them to be able to ask scientists, how is this? Why? It's like a child, why? And I started to learn, and it is a journey. And I always say this to everyone: when we go out and start doing things in our life, you start off as a junior. You're learning along the way. But the difference is I came from a creative background and a business background. That means that my way of thinking was slightly different to other people. So you'd sit there and go, well, why haven't we tried this? And they may have come back and said, well, we did it because blah, blah, blah. Fine. Or they may have said, well, actually, we haven't tried that because of this. And then we can say, well, we're willing to take the risk and push to try that approach. And so it started off, first of all, my first task was plastics. So at the time, David Attenborough had come out with Blue Planet. There was a famous scene of a whale holding its dead baby, which they believed had the toxins in her milk had sort of affected that baby and it had died. And that was the zeitgeist for plastics in the environment. So we started working with them to help develop their plastics They were doing a lot, but we were trying to take it steps further. And that was when I learned about social justice, social injustice of plastics. So it suddenly was no longer just a matter of plastics are bad for the environment in the ocean. Plastics are bad for us and our health. And plastics, our waste plastic, is being exported to the global south countries because we can't be bothered to deal with them. So that also made a change. So suddenly, I often talk about carbon tunnel vision. We can look at something and say we're only looking at everything for, carbon reduction, okay? But we're not thinking about the other externalities. And I think it's really important. It was the biggest lesson I learned. Always look wider. What are the other impacts? And then knowing that, okay, how upstream can we go to solve that problem? Because it's no good. And the perfect analogy is if you're an operating theater and your artery is bleeding, you don't want your surgeon mopping up the floor. You actually want them to deal with the problem where it really matters. And so that's really how our work is. Where is that artery? How can we get the right surgeons to do the right things to either slow it down, mitigate it, stop it?
I appreciate what you're saying about being creative. And I think creativity has such a large role in this movement. And we don't all have to be scientists to help the process forward, because scientists do think a certain way and other people with disciplines and different mindsets think a different way. And it can be super valuable to have the melding of those, different approaches working kind of in concert. And so I appreciate what you're doing on that front. So tell us kind of what then led to your next steps as far as starting the Gallifrey Foundation.
Okay, so both my husband and I come from these different backgrounds. And I think at the end, what we're looking at is we're tiny. We're not an IUCN or a WWF. We're very, very small. It's basically my husband and I and a few part-time people.
Well, I know as you were talking, I was thinking of somebody I've had on the show a few times, Senator Ben Allen, who's the California state senator who helped push this plastics legislation in California to reduce the amount of plastics that are used out here. And, it was kind of a landmark thing. Now I see the plastics industry is crying that it's going to take longer and they want another year to implement these changes. I was curious as to whether or not that legislation is on the radar back in Europe, and what types of legislation you're seeing in Europe to reduce the use of plastics.
In Europe, we have the Single-Use Plastics Directive. That was probably one of the fastest legislations that was passed. I think it was 2017 or 2019 that it actually went into EU regulations, and then countries had 2 years to ratify it. And basically saying ratify means the country has to say, this is how I'm going to interpret that law into my national laws. And the reason why that worked is governments and everyone were not, the plastics industry hadn't managed to mobilize itself enough to counter that. So it slipped in. And that's about 10 articles. It's plastic forks, it's balloon sticks, it's cutlery, it's plastic bags. So you have got quite a lot of different things, which is great. And we actually, as civil society and campaigners, have a tracker of who's doing the best at actually implementing those laws. So that's where the campaign start part will be the bleating about who's good, who's bad, name and shame, because that keeps the pressure on. So in that sense, that's how that has worked. We are now, I don't know if you know that there's a big treaty being negotiated, the Global Plastics Treaty, which will lead to the COP. A COP is Conference of the Parties. So we know of the climate COP. I think that's quite well known. But then you have a biodiversity COP, and then we'll end up with a plastics COP. That will be the final outcome. And that's where all nations will come together and they will agree the framework under which all negotiations regarding global plastic regulations will take place. We're into round 5. It was meant to terminate last year, but we had a few stubborn members, wonder who. And so now we're in 5.2. So the point is that it's like everything. We're now trying to find different ways to highlight to member states, who will be the ones making the decisions, why they should go for a high ambitious treaty. And an ambitious treaty would mean let's try and reduce the amount of unnecessary plastic production, because all plastic production, 40% of it is single-use plastics. So, or packaging. So, which is crazy. It is absolutely crazy when we think, and so this is the other part that maybe your listeners don't know, but if you and I mentioned earlier that we have 70% microplastics in our body. At one of these negotiation events, we handed out a cookie, like a credit card. And we said, have you had your weekly dose of microplastics? Because there was a statistic that came out that we're ingesting the equivalent of a credit card's worth of microplastics. And it went down quite well because some people knew and they laughed about it, and other people were actually fascinated by this. So it created a debate. It started creating questions linking this to health. So plastics, in order to make them soft, hard, or squishy, require certain chemicals and plasticizers. And the key thing here, which I think people should be aware of, is that those chemicals actually have an unfortunate thing. They mimic our hormones. And our hormone delivery system is not like the dose makes the poison, i.e. the more you're exposed to, it's the constant microdosing, the constant touching, ingesting, inhaling, all of that gets into our body and that starts to impact us. And it's now being linked with a number of neurodegenerative diseases and cancers, infertility. And so all of these are actually quite real. So what are we trying to do? We're trying to alert member states that there is a health impact of plastic. So surely we'd want to get rid of those chemicals. And in fact, funnily enough, with the Trump administration, that would be something I would expect them to be pushing straight forward on, because they want a healthy population and removing all these terrible chemicals. Then we also have the impact, the economic impact. If we have fertility problems, what's going to go down the line? So this is where we play different angles and try and find a narrative or a policy or a fact that will help a member state go back to their country and go, guys, girls, we need to look at this seriously because this will have an impact on our future. That's kind of the way we work.
We have to take our wins where we can get them, and we're not going to completely phase out plastics tomorrow, but looking at a downward trajectory of the use of them in their most harmful forms.
I think that would be the ideal. Obviously, we want to, and again, it's back to the artery. Surely we want to get rid of everything that is unnecessary. And the sad part is that there are so many alternatives which would be fantastic, but the problem is they're not subsidized to the tune of 17 trillion as the fossil fuel industry is. So we've got a little bit of a market problem there. But, there are ways. And also, I think there's a willingness. We just did a survey in Switzerland, and it was basically asking people to count their plastic for a week and then to report on it. We compiled all the statistics. And at the end, we said, do you feel that plastics have any impact on your health? Are you worried about that? And we got 93% of people saying yes. That's a powerful statistic to go back to Parliament.
I think that certainly boycotting has a place in our society. It's not the sole tool that is going to get industry to change, but it is a tool, and it's a tool of conscious companies to say, hey, we're going to not use these if we're in a fast food chain or we're in something else. And then a consumer can feel, hey, I prefer to go to this company that is sourcing more responsibly and ethically.
I agree with you, but my model is always if I'm a single mother with 2 children holding a full-time job. The crux point is convenience. And so we have to try whatever our solutions are to make it convenient for whatever that substitute or different delivery system might be. And that is where it was interesting. I actually did a podcast and was quite heartwarming. A woman had said, I took my 7-year-old son to the supermarket and I said, this time we're going to try and avoid anything in plastic. Let's have a game. And she said he took to it immediately. He knew what this was all about. And he was, Mom, look at this. This is not in plastic. Should we try that? How about this? And he really enjoyed it. And she said, I've never had such fun with my son shopping for food because he was looking for new things. So it became a game. And I think in the end, it's that kind of how do we switch the perspective from being something that is a burden, a pain, into something that can be joyous and fun and still be good.
Well, tell us a little bit, let's switch gears a bit as far as your championing of women in the environmental leadership space and what has that looked like?
Well, that started off I am firmly in the ocean space, okay? That was where I started. It's where my heart is. But so I became the co-founder of a campaign group called She Changes Climate. And that came about one day when COP26, that's the climate conference, was taking place in Glasgow in the UK. And Boris Johnson was the prime minister. And in his inimitable wisdom, he decided to select the high-level team, all men. So he didn't even think about this. He just went, oh, you, my friends, whatever. And it was like, and that was that moment. And we all have an epiphany moment when I thought that this problem had been solved. I thought that this was no longer an issue. How wrong am I? So I'm with a group of a number of women. Obviously, we sort of said, this is crazy or whatever. And then I literally the next morning, I said, look, I don't give a damn what happens at COP. But what happens at COP affects my work. And if we don't do something about this, then this is going to carry on and we have to do something. So again, we sort of started to see who was out there, but my co-founder was based in the UK. And between us, we literally said, okay, we're going to create a statement. We're going to get women to sign this, high level women. We had a Nobel Prize winner. We had Laurence Tubiana, who is one of the architects of the Paris Climate Agreements. We had Christiana Figueres. We had Emma Watson, Emma Thompson. We had all sorts of people signing it, and it was great. But at the same time, we spoke with Alok Sharma, who was the COP26 president, and said, we really need you to make a change or else we're going to publish this letter. I didn't realize that Britain is they were very reactive to that threat. And so what happened was by the time COP26 came around, 3 women were in the high-level team, but the most important one was the deputy chief negotiator for the UK. And that was really important. We still griped. We said it should have been co. Why does she have to be deputy? Why can't she be co-negotiator? But anyway, you suddenly start realizing, and now I'm going to just say the reality of a journey. So we thought, yay, we've done something. We're doing good. And suddenly I was targeted because guess what? I'm a white, middle-aged, privileged woman. Where's my lived experience of what true climate change is? And that was a really humbling experience, but it was also really educational. And it was like, I am not the person to be doing this. This is not my story. So then we made a pivot and we started saying, we've got privilege to be able to enable the conduit, the passages, but it's our job to find women on the front line who are actually experiencing the real stories and to get their voices. And it's not just a seat at the table, it's their voice at the table. So now we've switched more to becoming a conduit for those groups, creating networks within smaller areas. And I think I just want to go back to another bigger picture. Why? Why is this important? Why do we need women? Okay, and of course I hear that a lot. But I think at the end...
Seems rather obvious to me, but go on.
We talk about biodiversity. What about biodiversity of thought and different perspectives? And women do bring different perspectives. I'm not saying everyone, not all men are thinking the same, not all women are thinking the same, but don't we need, I mean, what did Einstein say? The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So it's not just women, it's youth, it's indigenous, it's basically creating that smorgasbord of different thoughts, which may be, and I will be honest, it can be a lot more tempestuous at the discussion level, but then you've got all those perspectives in at the same time, and they do bring a more robust, more valuable output than the same vanilla thinking in and it's garbage in, garbage out data. And we really need to change that. So I actually think it's a loss of value. We're not actually, you've got half the planet and you're not actually using that value to good effect.
Well, I totally agree with, empowering women at all levels. And I feel like that is one of the reasons why we have the set of problems that we have across the globe. I mean, whether it's the wars that we have to the environmental destruction, that I think that if we had more women leaders and more women at the table, a lot of these issues would be looked at differently, solved differently because of the perspectives that women bring to the table. So I believe that is the revolution of the 21st century, is that, empowerment of women and at all levels.
So going back to the example I said of trying to synchronize different inputs when, campaigners and policymakers and whatever, it's the same principle. The more people that you can bring in together and get there, the more you're going to ground truth where the potential problems are down the line, the more likely you are to end up with something that is actually workable, because you've had everyone who feels they are part of this, they have ownership. And there's that lack. And it's kind of, as my grandmother used to say, common sense is not common. I would agree with her. And there are so many people who are so passionate. And my job, I consider my job, is to take what they do and see how we can either connect them with other groups to really amplify the impact of their work. And some of that might be just listening and finding out what they're doing, what are their challenges. I'll give you an example. Right now, we're bringing together people from different nations who work in trying to protect sharks. I don't know if you know, sharks are killed. 100 million sharks are killed each year. And despite all these laws and policies that are meant to protect them, that number has not changed since I started. It's got worse. So what's going wrong here? So the thing is, let's get all the groups together, find out what are they doing that works, what are they doing that doesn't work, what would they like to see done, and then we're going to map that out, and then we're going to take it to the next stage and bring in all the big policy makers, different laws. It might be fisheries, it might be the trade in convention and trade in international trade in endangered species. It may be different things, and find out what happens what's going wrong, where are the holes, because this is not working, and what would need to be done. So that's kind of the thing that we like to do, but it's based on their work and they need that credit. So all I want to do at the moment is just understand more, again, being the person who knows nothing. And then, like that, you're going to ask the questions. Why doesn't this work? Why doesn't that? That's how we wing it. We take high risk because sometimes things can go wrong, but sometimes things go right.
Well, thank you for all the work that you're doing, and tell the audience a little bit about things that they could do that you think would make a difference, or, words of encouragement, thoughts as to where they can go to find you and find the work that you're doing and support the work that you're doing, which is truly inspiring to me.
Thank you. Well, I suppose that the first thing I would say to anyone is think about, you have power. Everyone has agency. You can either choose what you choose to eat and maybe eat a lot less fish if you can, because that is going to reduce pressure on overfishing. Your wallet, it's what you choose to buy. if you can, again, and no one is expecting this to happen in a day, but it starts with one step, your voice. I actually make a point of signing petitions every day. And I sit there and I think, oh, can we go again? But you'd be surprised when you have a large number that gets to a policymaker and they can go back and say, oh my God, 100,000 people in this, area have said this. That adds up. Don't ever diminish your power to talk about something. I think at the end of the day, the other thing is that we all have to understand that we are on a journey. There is a lot going on in the planet right now to cause us grief. So find your community, find people with whom you can talk. Your guest list is community. They're incredible. Those are people you could, I could talk to Bill. I could talk to Captain Paul. Those are things that matter. So reach out to your friends who share the same thoughts as you and start talking about it. Create a WhatsApp group or a Signal group or whatever. I don't know what to use these days. But basically, just that I think is your first thing. I think to get involved in campaigning, there are enough. We all know about the Sea Shepherds, Captain Paul Watson Foundation. We've got all of these different groups that are not too difficult to research. So again, I'm not going to point you to one direction or another. But I think at the end of the day, it's up to us to educate ourselves. And that I think is the most important thing. I always ask people, what was the day that made you stop using a plastic bottle? Or what was the day that made you stop eating fish? What was that pivotal moment that you went, I'm changing? I love that. I think that's the most exciting thing.
Well, I think that's well said. And we all can make change every single day, and we can make better choices, and we can raise our voices and be contributing to the solution rather than being part of the problem. And that is a process. It doesn't happen in one day or 1 week or 1 year, but it's something that we can all be kind of working together. And as you said, as a community, it certainly makes it easier when we're working in concert. It makes it more fun. And so thank you, Antoinette, for being on the program. It's been delightful having you. And, please give a shout out to your organization, where people can find you and work together with you.
Thank you. So it's Gallifrey Foundation. And if people forget what that is the science TV Doctor Who. It's his home planet, Gallifrey. So Gallifrey.Foundation, and you'll find us there.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thanks again.
Lovely. Thank you very much for having me. I feel very honored.
To learn more about our work at A Climate Change and how you can help us reach our goal planting 30,000 trees in the Amazon this year, visit aclimatechange.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like this episode, please share it with a friend. See you next time.